Hello, and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guests are Alejandro de la Fuente, Robert Woods Bliss, Professor of Latin American History and Economics, Professor of African and African American Studies, and Director of the Afro-Latin American Research Institute at Harvard University, and Ariela J. Gross, John B. and Alice R. Sharp Professor of Law and History and co-director of the Center for Law, History, and Culture at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. We will discuss their new book, Becoming Free, Becoming Black, Race, Freedom, and Law in Cuba, Virginia, and Louisiana, which is published by Cambridge University Press. So welcome to the show, Alejandro and Ariela.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. I'm so glad we were able to arrange this interview because I thought your book was fantastic and a really rich archival study of three fascinating jurisdictions and the sort of history of racial slavery in those jurisdictions. So I wonder if you could start by talking a little bit about the origins of the project and how the two of you came to work on it together.
Sure. It's almost embarrassing to realize how long we've worked on this project together, probably on and off for about 10 years. And both of us had already been thinking about a lot of these issues in different places. I worked on the history of race and racism and the law in the United States, and Alejandro had been working on studies of free people, enslaved people making claims on the law in Cuba. And we both got interested in thinking about race comparatively. For me, that came up because in my earlier study, which looked at trials of racial identity in the United States when courts were trying to figure out whether someone was Black or white, usually in order to decide what kind of rights they could have, I was surprised to find how many people in the United States kind of lived on a middle ground between Black and white. And the comparative story that's usually told is that, it's Latin America where there are all of these kind of gradations of racial identity and fluidity of race, but that the U.S. is just Black and white. And that made me want to go further in comparing the United States to Cuba or other, another part of Latin America, and to try to figure out where really is the difference.
So when I don't think there is anything embarrassing about this. It takes these projects do take a long time to come together. And it's not that we were working on this uninterruptedly for the last 10 years or so. I think it took us both a while to, we began by working on a couple of papers. We published a couple of articles, and I don't know, at some point, and I frankly do not remember exactly when, but at some point we felt that we were ready to move to the next stage and to actually write a book together. And at that point, we were both advanced enough in our own careers that we could also decide to do something like this without really knowing what we were getting into, because there were major chunks for the research for the book that neither Ariela nor I had done before. So we actually had to do substantial new primary research across linguistic barriers and across jurisdictions to be able to write the book together, which I must say has been a wonderful experience.
Well, so Ariela mentioned, among other things, that there's a kind of conventional wisdom around the relationship between slavery and freedom, or the availability of freedom. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of what that conventional wisdom was, and what caused you to question whether that was really the full story. And sort of, did you have a sense of what the story you were likely to find was going to be before you did the archival research, or were there aspects of the archival research that were surprising to you?
To some extent, I certainly found myself surprised by some of the things that we found. I think we were trying to answer the question of how was it that three societies that were similar in many ways, they were both kind of all three full-blown plantation slave societies at their peak, but they came from three different legal traditions. There was a French colony, a Spanish, and a British. They three societies that in some ways started from very similar beginnings, and that colonists in all three places, kind of almost as soon as they arrive in the new world, they get down to the business of enshrining racial distinctions into law, and associating degraded and enslaved status with Blackness and African origins. And yet by 1860, the possibilities for a free person of color to have a place in the public life of that society is quite different in Cuba on the one hand, Virginia and Louisiana on the other. And so that was really the question we were trying to answer, is how is it that they end up so different? And I think the conventional answer had been either, well, that was enshrined by the difference between a civil law and a common law tradition, or a Catholic and a Protestant, but essentially, from the beginning, static over time, it was inevitable from the beginning, or this idea about how different kinds of racial regimes, in the sense of the gradations between black and white, that was a real difference between Latin America and the United States. And I think we were surprised, or at least I was surprised, to see how much change over time there was, and how much, for example, in the earliest century, like in the 17th century, it's actually Virginia that has the greatest openness, because they don't have precedents for slavery in their law, and they're still working stuff out, and there's still a lot of possibility for a free person of color, or for someone to claim freedom, for example, based on being Christian or having a white father, or things like that. So I think there were quite a few surprises, and a lot of them were about really what happens over time. I don't know, Alejandro might see it differently, I'm not sure, or different aspects might have struck him.
I totally agree that with the surprise element, because if you recall, Ariela, our initial impulse was to actually produce a very detailed comparative study of slave law in these jurisdictions. And we thought that the conventional wisdom had always been that differences in what a previous generation of scholars would have called race relations were anchored in differences in legal slave regimes in places like Cuba or Brazil and the United States. And we actually began our study sort of following that track. And along the way, we realized that rather than the law of slavery, it was the law of freedom that made a more important, had a greater impact on the creation of racial regimes in these jurisdictions. So we began to pay much more attention and to do more research on how the law constituted blackness as a category of social debasement, and also on regulations that particularly addressed blacks or negros or noirs, regardless of social status. Moments in the law, moments of race making in the law in which blackness, regardless of status, was constituted as the subordinate, as a subordinate social position. So along the way, we sort of shifted our emphasis from one area of legal production to another. And I think that was a surprise to, certainly to me, but I think to both of us.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how each of these jurisdictions seems to have started with a kind of different version of slave law. Sort of where did that come from, and how did that affect the initial concept of who was enslaved and what their capacity to try to claim freedom would have been?
Well, I think I mentioned earlier that the surprising fact that, Virginia in some ways is the most up for grabs because the British arrive, or the English colonists arrive without having kind of social and legal precedents for slavery. And that's in real contrast to both the Spanish and the French. The Spanish have this big head start when they arrive in Havana because they've been enslaving Africans in the Mediterranean, and so they have, not only a medieval code, but also just local ordinances and practices that can be translated really directly to what they do in Havana. And when the French arrive a century later in the early 18th century in Louisiana, they have had practice in the Caribbean. They already have a code. They tinker with it and tighten it up for Louisiana. They come out with some new ordinances, but they hit the ground running in a way that isn't true in Virginia. The big difference is, and the aspect that is really key in setting Cuba apart from both of the other places, is that they never limit the right to the ability of an owner of slaves to manumit or emancipate those people, and that practice of manumission continues unrestricted in Cuba, whereas in both French Louisiana and in Virginia, those restrictions are added. Sometimes they're relaxed at different moments over the centuries we look at, and then they're tightened again. But those restrictions become really important in limiting the ability to create a meaningfully large community of free people of color.
Yeah, and that has an enormous impact in the long term. I think it's important to say that in the case of Cuba, this doesn't happen because of any special cultural or ethical consideration in terms of the owners of enslaved people in Cuba or in the rest of Spanish America. It has to do with the fact that manumission in the Iberian world was not tied to race. Manumission was ransoming Christian or Muslim slaves in Mediterranean Iberia was a very common practice. People would go in and out of slavery depending on their luck. and their circumstances. So the practice is part of the culture of legal culture of slavery and enslavement in early 16th century Iberia, and it's transferred to the New World. And therefore, it's a practice that never is tied, runs parallel to efforts to create a racial order. But of course, it is a practice that in some ways undermines the racial order, because every enslaved African or person of African descent who manages to escape from enslavement through manumission, through various forms of manumission, or more frequently self-purchase, each of those persons would then contribute to undermine a racial order, a perfect racial order in which Africans and people of African descent will all be enslaved and Europeans would be free.
I wonder if you could reflect a little or discuss a little how enslaved people actually used the law of freedom in each of these jurisdictions to try to kind of claim their own freedom, whether that's through manumission or through purchasing their freedom, and how those societies responded to that.
So Alejandro mentioned the fact that in Cuba, manumission does not become tied to race. And that's really in contrast to what happens first in Virginia and then later really in Louisiana. So I think to me, one of the most surprising things was what happens in the Age of Revolution, because I was really used to thinking about the Age of Revolution in terms of what the revolutionary historian Bernard Bailyn called the contagion of liberty, and this idea that was a moment in the late 18th century when everybody is getting the news kind of around the Atlantic about freedom, right? And you've got revolutions not only in France and the United States, but in Haiti, and you have emancipation in the northern states, and a flood of freedom suits in places like Virginia. And so I was used to thinking about that moment as just a time of the expansion of freedom. And as we look more closely, though, it's certainly true that this is a moment when enslaved people use every tool available to them. In Virginia, there are two main ways that people are able to take advantage of new opportunities in the Age of Revolution. Neither of them was kind of meant for them, but they turn them to their use. So, for example, there's a law passed in Virginia against importation of slaves into Virginia. Now, this is essentially like a protectionist law, right, about protecting prices of slaves in the market in Virginia from flooding the market with slaves from outside the state. But the penalty for illegal importation is to emancipate the slave. And so enslaved people learn about this and they start bringing lawsuits saying, I should be free because I was illegally imported into the state. Hundreds of people are bringing these lawsuits based on illegal importation. And even after the legislature tries to shut things down because they're getting this flood, they try to shut it down in 1806, and you're still seeing these suits in as late as the 1820s, even 1830s. So it's remarkable how people will use every lever they have to great effect, and yet these are not laws that were passed for their benefit, right? They were not laws that, in fact, they were about shoring up the system of slavery. And the other thing that happens is in Virginia is that people bring claims based on Indian identity, and that really ties manumission to race because they say, I should be free because I'm not Black, I'm not a Negro, I am, my ancestor was Indian, and so I shouldn't be enslaved. And that never happens in Cuba.
But in each of these jurisdictions, what we find is how enslaved people use any legal recourse available, to sometimes stretching those in really novel ways, as Ariela was referring to before, in order to claim freedom, or to claim, sometimes, if not freedom as a whole, to claim, some degree of control over their lives, some degree of autonomy. And in some cases, they managed to do incredible things. Ariela was mentioning this law, the importation law in Virginia. In Cuba, and also in Spanish Louisiana, after the 1760s, slaves managed to basically impose an interpretation of self-purchase practices, of customary self-purchase practices, that were highly beneficial to them, because they could basically pay their freedom in installments. They could offer a down payment, and they managed to have those payments recognized, legally recognized. And that opened up a whole space for debate about whether an enslaved person who had already purchased a part of himself or herself, or a part of his or her time, was entitled, in fact, to control, to some proportional control over time and labor. Of course, the owners were adamantly opposed to this, but there are hundreds of cases in which the courts were forced to deal with these questions, and these questions, which had major legal implications, were forced by the enslaved themselves.
So the story you tell in the book suggests that at least some of the differences in where Cuba kind of ended up in the mid 19th century in relation to slavery, as opposed to where Virginia and Louisiana ended up, was a function of where they started. Do you think there were other factors, other social factors, or other economic factors, or other demographic factors, maybe, that influenced the ultimate kind of development of the institution of slavery and the availability of manumission and the creation of free Black communities?
So one factor that we think is very important here, Ariela mentioned the age of revolution. These three jurisdictions arrived at the age of revolution with vastly different social demographic configurations. Cuba arrived at the age of revolution with a fairly large community of free people of color, and the size and the strength and the importance, the social assertiveness of that community is something that would have to be destroyed in order to create a perfect racial world of enslaved Blacks and free whites. So that is a very important distinction that is already there by the time of the Age of Revolution. But then the Age of Revolution, there are moments in the Age of Revolution, there are impulses, there are opportunities, there are possibilities that, at least for some time, it looked like Virginia may come closer, and in fact did come closer to Cuba and to what was at the time Spanish Louisiana, because the free population of color in Virginia did grow dramatically between the 1780s, or the 1770s and 1800 or so. But that doesn't diminish the fact that in the case of Cuba, there was already a fairly large community, and this is true not just of Havana, but the rest of the island as well, and that community provided crucial resources for other enslaved people to escape slavery. Not just financial resources, which were of course very important, but also other social resources. Networks of support, access to knowledge, access to proper officials. So that's a factor that we devote quite a bit of time and quite a bit of attention to that factor in the book, Brian.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say about the Age of Revolution there is about the importance of politics and the connection that gets made in Virginia and later Louisiana, between manumission and individual emancipation with the fear of mass emancipation, or what they call general emancipation. So, at the time of, in particular, I think the 1830s, when you have, Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia, you have the beginnings of this much more vocal political campaign for the abolition of slavery, and revolutionary pamphlets being smuggled around the South by free people of color. The petitions that flood into the Virginia legislature are saying, we want to put a stop to individual emancipations, or what they call partial emancipation, because that's the first step in general emancipation. This is going to lead to the end of slavery, and we can't have free Black people living side by side with white people. We will have to remove them. We will have to send them out of the state or out of the country. And there's this whole movement for removal of free people of color. And even anti-slavery advocates think, Black people and white people can't live side by side. And so that idea that it's threatening to the whole system of slavery if one owner frees one slave, or someone purchases their own freedom through hard work, that isn't seen as a threat in a traditional slave system, right? In fact, most slave systems throughout history have incorporated that. So that's really about the political moment, ironically, of the American Republic, that comes to seem so threatening. We're extending citizenship to all white men, and we can't have free Black people out here claiming citizenship.
Well, one of the things I really enjoyed about the book was like the incredible number of like fascinating personal stories that sort of came out of your archival research. And I wonder if there were particular stories that jumped out at you or that really stuck with you that you'd be interested in sharing with listeners.
Alejandro, did you have any favorites? I know I have mine.
It's an interesting question whether I have a favorite story. So I'm thinking if I do have a favorite story. Actually, I don't think I do. I don't think I have a favorite story. I think I have favorite initiatives. I have favorite moments in the book about. We both arrived to this book with we were both doing histories, legal histories of slavery from the bottom up. We were both doing social histories and cultural histories of slavery from the bottom up, and trying to understand how enslaved people shaped legal regimes and shaped legal interpretations and legal practices in places in the United States and Cuba. So we had that in common, and therefore, and I think that shows in the book. That's why you have many of these examples and individual stories. But I don't really. It's a good question, Brian. I don't really have. I think Ariela does, but I don't.
Well, I'll tell you just two. Here are two things that came to mind for me. One of, and I guess it's because I'm especially attracted, and maybe this is, my husband always calls me Pollyanna, because I'm always going to find the bright side of whatever the tragic story is. And in many ways, if you're talking about a history of race in under slavery, and you're talking about the shutting down of possibilities for free people of color, it's a pretty tragic story. But I am always humbled and amazed by the ways that people did make use of these legal openings. And one in particular, I loved tracing in Virginia. I mentioned that people made these claims based on Indian identity. And one of the things I found so striking is that if one person was able to win a claim showing that she was descended from a free Indian woman and therefore won her freedom based on that ancestry, if one person won a claim like that, the legal knowledge would travel throughout the community of free people of color, sometimes to counties far away, that anyone related to that Indian great-grandmother, any descendant, might also be able to make a claim for freedom, because using this precedent of their third cousin's case. And we've been able to find, and actually, as a historian named Honor Sachs, who's at the University of Colorado, has done great work on this, kind of tracing those networks of sometimes dozens of family members winning cases based on that same great grandmother, and the resources it took. People who were probably illiterate, held in bondage, with very little access to, we talk about access to justice today, access to lawyers, and yet they're able to transmit that knowledge. And the other one of my favorite cases, and this is sort of an example of how none of the three places we're talking about are hermetically sealed from one another. They were in conversation with each other, but that doesn't mean that the same claims worked in all places. So we write about one case in Louisiana, which happened in very late in the game. I think it was in the 1840s in New Orleans. So pretty late. It's been an American state, for 30 years. But there's still some memory, both in the legal system and also among the citizens, memory of Spanish traditions, legal traditions. And you still find cases where people bring a claim based on having purchased themselves through one of these installment contracts that Alejandro was talking about under Spanish law. In the 19th century, people are still making those claims. So I found one case where this hatter, claimed that he had a purchase contract to buy himself for $800. He'd already paid, I think, $500. I can't remember if he paid $500, had $300 left, or the other way around. He'd paid $500. And not only did he think, that his owner should be held to that contract, but his lawyer actually made the argument that he owned 5/8 of his time because of this contract, that he should get wages for 5 out of every 8 hours and be able to put those towards his purchase price. And this was a claim that was made quite often in Cuba, and sometimes won in Cuban cases. He's kind of laughed out of court in Louisiana, but I just thought it was so remarkable that that in as late as the 1840s, he's still drawing on that Spanish legal tradition and kind of trying to find maneuver a legal way to say, actually, I've paid my whole price and I should be free.
Ariela and Alejandro, in closing, I wonder if you could reflect briefly on what you think the sort of core contributions of your book are, and how you hope this book might inflect scholarship in this area and thinking about the history of slavery in relation to the history of free African Americans.
So we offer a new take on an old question, Brian. The question itself is not new. This is a question that has haunted scholars of slavery and race in the United States and Latin America for a very long time, since at least the mid 20th century, if not before. Because the contrast between the two regions is something that has preoccupied scholars for a very long time. But we not only offer a different answer or set of answers to that old question, we also try to construct those answers by carefully studying and centering the initiatives and the actions of Africans and people of African descent in these jurisdictions. Something that, of course, we could do because the scholarship on race and slavery has increased dramatically in the U.S., but also in Latin America in the last few decades. So I think that's our main contribution. We decided to finish the book at the time of emancipation, roughly in all these jurisdictions. Moment of war, of conflict in Virginia, Louisiana, and Cuba as well. And we finished with this feeling that, in a sense, our finding about the importance of the law of freedom and how it helped define and create a race has in turn long-term effects, which we do not explore in the book, but that we hope other scholars may pursue in their own research.
It also, and unfortunately, it's hard not to see echoes of some of the things that we're talking about in the book today. And to me, I think one of the most important contributions of the book is to explain how it is that citizenship becomes so tied to whiteness in the law in the United States in a way it doesn't in Cuba, and that's really the key difference in the racial regimes, that it isn't about kind of gradations of color that makes the difference between these places. It's how possible is it for a free person of color to make a claim to be part of public life or claim to citizenship in the U.S. and the fact that in the U.S. citizenship becomes reserved for white people, and of course that's what at issue after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, and unfortunately it's still something we see being challenged today.
Great. Well, Alejandro, Ariela, thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about this important new book. I really enjoyed reading it, and I really enjoyed talking to you about it. And I hope listeners will pick up a copy themselves, because we've really only scratched the surface, and there's a lot more in there.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks so much for having us.
conozco un gambao que está siempre pelado como el hijo del morón. Mira, te dicen gambao por tu pata jorobá, y donde quiera que tú vas, siempre te canta pelao. Que mira, a ti te dicen el ripiao por tu pata jorobá, y donde quiera que tú vas, siempre te canta pelao. Boloña como juega, con quien sabe no se juega. Boloña, Boloña buena, Boloña tú estás que pela, se formó la choricera. Boloña, Boloña buena, no, 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 no lo coge que te quema.